Things are better now. We can live our lives.
It killed a lot of innocent people, like for no reason at all.
I still can't believe it. I'm still saying hello to everybody. I'm seeing my mother for the first time in 14 years.
After 14 years, we just want justice.
We're going back to Damascus. We got rid of the tyrant.
To our viewers watching on PBS in the United States and to all of you around the world, welcome. We begin the day again inside and outside Syria. It has been only a few days since rebel forces quickly toppled the Assad regime. Now, just as fast, those Islamist factions are moving to reshape the country. As crowds continue to celebrate their newfound freedom, Reuters is reporting that former rebels are planning to suspend the existing legislature. This will reportedly include a committee of experts to be appointed to make amendments to the country's constitution. The weapons of war may have largely fallen silent inside Damascus and other major cities, but not all is quiet, especially along the border with Israel. Israeli troops on Thursday continued their move into and across the Golan Heights into Syrian territory. Images not seen in half a century. Israeli warplanes have also been targeting suspected weapons dumps inside Syria. And that is one of several flashpoints all along Syria's borders with its neighbors. Syria's disparate armed factions are looking to cement their own interests moving forward. The victorious Islamist-led HTS are now in control of most of the country. Now that they've set up a government in Damascus, they've set their sights on the rest of Syria. Now, much of the northeast is held by the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, while the Turkish-backed group calling itself the Syrian National Army controls much of the territory, as you see there, along the northern border. Syria's Kurds had been hoping for autonomy or self-rule, but the HTS's those advances have people fearing the worst.
Syrian Kurds wasted no time in destroying remnants of Assad's rule. They are among the many Syrian minorities to have suffered under his lengthy regime.
We've been waiting for 13 years and today is our day. It's the Kurds and Kurdistan's day. And God willing, it will be full of joy and happiness.
Ethnic Kurds make up about 10% of Syria's population, along with sizable minorities in Iran, Iraq and Turkey. Separatists have long battled for an independent state, making them a target for various governments. During Syria's civil war, the Kurdish-led Democratic Forces fought to create a semi-autonomous area in the country's northeast. US troops backed them in fighting the rise of IS in the region and in controlling the oil-rich area. But neighbouring Turkey has long fought against the Syrian Kurds. It has backed renewed attacks in recent days, fearing Kurdish separatism within its own borders. Turkey has also supported the HTS rebels who toppled the Assad regime and will now help shape Syria's future. Many Kurds fled Aleppo just hours after the rebels took control of the city. While they've tried to assure minorities they are not at risk, not everyone is convinced.
The minorities are worried about how they will be treated. Those who have taken over now have come out with positive slogans and statements. But in practice, everyone is hopeful and expectant. People are waiting to see if these positive statements will materialize in practice.
The fall of the Assad regime could present many risks to Syrian Kurds, but as the country begins to rebuild, there may also be opportunities for their long-held goal of self-governance.
Well, joining me here at the big table is Guido Steinberg. He's a Middle East analyst and international terrorism expert from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, a familiar face to our viewers. Guido, good to see you. Let me just ask you, the speed of everything that's happened in the last week, did you expect things to happen this quickly?
No. I have to confess, even on Thursday, when the rebels were advancing on Homs, I didn't expect the Assad regime to fall. I simply couldn't imagine that all the Alawite elite forces, the Republican Guard, the 4th Division, the paramilitaries of the intelligence services would simply melt down. I simply couldn't believe it.
What about the situation for the Kurds, the future for the Kurds? The only shooting that is going on right now seems to be aimed at them. Why is that fighting, why is it still ongoing?
Well, I think it's only the beginning, because what we do see in Syria is a major victory for Turkey. The rebel territory in Idlib that was ruled by HTS, or that is still ruled by HTS, was a Turkish protectorate for years already. So what we see now is a victory of a Turkish client in Damascus, together with the Syrian National Army, which are in fact Turkish auxiliaries. They have become Turkish auxiliaries in recent years. So it is only logical that these forces will now fight for the one Turkish cause in Syria, and that's the demise of the PKK, the Syrian Kurds in the east of the country.
So the HTS coming to power in Damascus is a good case, if not a best case scenario in the eyes of Erdogan, if you're looking at it from Turkey. But that's a very damning indictment for the Kurds.
Yes, it is. But it is a fact. Turkey and Qatar have been supporting Islamists all over the Middle East in the recent decade. And now, for the first time, Turkey has scored a major victory. But its main interest in the country is not to have an ally in Damascus. Its main interest is to battle the Kurds in order for the PKK, and it is the PKK that is fighting in the east, not to reach an autonomy or even an independent state.
My producer was very keen on getting this in, and it says a lot about the way we perceive the Kurds. There's often a leftist, romanticized view of the Kurds as an egalitarian, grassroots, anarchist movement, and that they operate under the moniker Syrian Democratic Forces. Is that the reality?
Well, if you believe that a democracy can be ruled by a single party, if you believe that the GDR and the Soviet Union were democracies, then you might believe that the PKK is a democratic movement. It's a single party, it's an authoritarian party, which, of course, proposes an ideology that is somewhat known to many leftists in the West. And that is where these sympathies come from. But still, it is authoritarian, and the PKK is on the European, the German, and the American terrorism list for a reason, simply because of the violence that it perpetrated.
I have to ask you about the United States. It's agreed to end its military presence in Iraq next year. What does that mean for the U.S. presence in Syria? And Donald Trump is about to take power.
Yeah, it was one of the major aims of Donald Trump's Middle East policies to end the American presence in Syria. I remember that it was only the adults in the room who saved the Kurds by convincing him to leave some 900 troops in the country. If the American presence in Iraq ends, the American presence in Syria is untenable. They will have to withdraw.
What about for the Europeans?
The Europeans?
Yeah, will they have a role?
Well, they might have a role, but not a military role. The Europeans have showed a pronounced disinterest in the fate of the Kurds in recent years. And I believe that Donald Trump will withdraw troops from Syria and Iraq. And that will probably mean that this Kurdish project in eastern Syria is doomed.
Russia would not support Assad to the end. What does his removal mean for Russia's presence in Syria and by extension for Russia's meddling in African countries?
Well, In Syria, it probably means that Russia will have to evacuate its two bases, the air base in Homaimim, close to Latakia, and the Navy base in Tartus. There are currently no Russian ships in Tartus anymore. I've seen some satellite photos in recent hours. I can't really imagine that HTS would accept a continued Russian presence, but we have to be a little bit careful. In Afghanistan, we had a similar situation where the Russians were considered to be an important enemy by the Taliban. Right after they took over in 2021, Russia and China built quite good relations to the regime over there. So, well, we might be up to some surprises in the relationship between HTS and the Russians, but I can't tell now.
Guido Steinberg, as always, Guido, good to have you in the studio. Good to get your analysis. Thank you.
Thank you.
For more, I'm joined now by Joost Hiltermann. He's director of the Middle East and North Africa program at the International Crisis Group, and he joins me from New Haven, Connecticut tonight. It's good to see you again. Let me ask you, are the Kurds, are they being left behind as Syria's political landscape shifts so rapidly?
Well, if you're a Kurd in Syria, you would say that you've been left behind by any central government or regime in Damascus for decades. The Kurds only gained control over majority Kurdish areas and beyond in 2012, 2013, when the regime in Damascus was on the back foot and needed someone to be the custodian of the Kurdish areas while it was preoccupied fighting rebels that had set their sights on Damascus itself, on central power. Kurds, of course, had no interest in central power in Damascus. So, but now with the new dispensation in Damascus, it is remains to be seen whether a new central government regime order, whatever you want to call it, in Damascus is going to take the same line as the Assad regime did toward the Kurds, or in fact is going to come to some kind of accommodation. I think it's way too early to say.
And what about Turkey? Is Turkey perhaps successfully sidelining Kurdish forces in Syria with its military campaigns?
Well, it would certainly like to do so, but it hasn't done it. It is currently supporting, has supported for quite some time, Syrian rebels under the Syrian National Army, which is a militia in the areas that Turkey occupies in northern Syria. And they are now fighting against the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is the Kurdish-dominated force in northeastern Syria. The SDF has had to abandon already Tel Rifat and Manbij and some other areas. But again, it's way too early to say. Clearly, the United States is telling Turkey not to proceed in this manner. And we'll see whether Turkey heeds that advice or that ultimatum, rather. The SNA by itself is in no position to carry out that fight by itself against the much stronger SDF. So we'll have to see.
You mentioned the United States. Have Kurdish forces, have they lost their leverage with Washington, or is U.S. support, is it still reliable at all?
Again, impossible to say because we're in the midst of a transition in Washington. Under the Biden administration, I would say no. The Kurds haven't lost their leverage. There is still a rationale of fighting ISIS, where the Kurds, of course, were a partner to the US military. That threat is much diminished in Syria, but it's still there even today in eastern Syria. But under the Trump administration, things could change because the Trump administration cares more about the Iranian influence than ISIS. And frankly, after what has happened now with the change in regime in Damascus, the Iranian influence has become a minor concern for the United States in Syria.
I'm wondering, Mr. Hiltermann, what happens to the U.S.-backed Kurdish fight against ISIS if the Kurds, if they lose their influence in Syria? I mean, do we have any idea of predicting what will happen there?
So I never predict anything. But I would say that it is going to fall on the HTS and the new government that they set up in Damascus to fight ISIS. And HTS and ISIS are no friends of each other. ISIS, HTS in its previous incarnation was violently fighting ISIS, and I'm sure it would continue to do so. And it may say that it doesn't need the United States. I don't know if it will do that. But it certainly would want foreign powers out of Syrian territory to leave Syria for the Syrians. If for some reason it proves to be too weak to do so, then it may de facto allow the United States to stay.
Joost Hiltermann with the International Crisis Group. Mr. Hiltermann, as always, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Henri Barkey is a senior fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and Cohen Professor of International Relations at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. He joins us from Bethlehem in the occupied West Bank. Thank you so much for your time today. Can I ask you, are the Kurds becoming the biggest losers in Syria in its rapidly changing political landscape?
Can I just correct you? My university is in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, not Palestine. And
apologies
I'm
for
actually
that.
In Washington. That's fine. I just wanted to correct the record. Look, I mean, for the Kurds, it's both, as your correspondent also said, it's an opportunity as well as a big danger. And the danger essentially comes from two sources. One is a new leadership in Syria. Yes, we have the HTS, which has come out and has made all the right sounds and protecting minorities, etc. But nobody really knows much about the composition of the HTS, whether it is unified, whether it's going to break up, and if there's going to be internal fighting afterwards. I mean, one wishes it doesn't happen, but that's one source of threats to the Kurds. The other are the Turks, and the Turks have been very adamant about not allowing any type of Kurdish autonomy in northern Syria. For the Turks, we have to understand that this is a strategic threat because after the Gulf War in Iraq, with the American help, you saw the creation of the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government, as a federal entity within Iraq. The Americans today are in Syria with the Syrian Kurdish forces because they're fighting ISIS together, the famous Islamist organization. But what the Turks fear is that what happened in Iraq will replicate itself in Syria, whereby you will have maybe not a federal arrangement in Syria, because it's hard to see how a federal arrangement would work in Syria overall, but maybe some kind of autonomy for the Kurds. And if you have autonomy federation in two parts of the Kurdish region, Turkey has 20% of its population is Kurdish. So Turkey is afraid that this will eventually translate into a movement by Turkish Kurds for more autonomy. There has been such efforts in Turkey, but they've been repressed. And this is what really drives Turkish policy in Syria. And they will do everything in their power to prevent the Kurds from achieving. And you've seen fighting going on. I mean, the Turks, by the way, criticized the Israelis yesterday about sending troops into Syria, but Turks have been occupying part of northwestern Syria for a long time. They also have created something called the National Syrian Army that works under their command and has been attacking with Turkish air support Kurdish position. So it's complicated. I mean, and that's a threat to the Kurds.
So could I ask you, I mean, how realistic are Kurdish hopes for maintaining any kind of autonomy?
Look, this ultimately, it's a good question. Ultimately, it depends on the deal the Kurds will make directly with Damascus. But for that deal to work, you have to have the involvement of the United States. President-elect Trump says Syria is not our issue. We're not interested. Let them deal with it themselves. The truth is, none of these problems in Syria can be solved without active U.S. participation. And it is in the interest of the U.S. to participate because it's spent already almost 10 years fighting ISIS. And the last thing you want is for ISIS to come back. And so we should also remember that there are 40,000 ISIS prisoners being held by Syrian Kurds. And if the Syrian Kurds were to disappear, so to say, what happens to those 40,000? Do they go back and start fighting again? I mean, so there are all kinds of complications down the road. But I believe it is possible. It doesn't mean it's going to happen. It is possible for the Syrian Kurds and Damascus to come up with some kind of arrangement. It will not be a federation a la KRG in Iraq, but it will recognize Kurdish rights. The problem was under Hafez al-Assad, or even before Hafez al-Assad, Kurds were denied even the basic rights. They were denied citizenship. And if you did not, if you lived in Kurdish areas in Syria, you didn't have citizenship, which means you couldn't go to school, you couldn't go to a hospital, you couldn't get any government funding, right? So these people need some recognition.
Henri Barkey, Senior Fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Let's take a closer look now with Middle East expert Bente Scheller of the Heinrich Böll Foundation. Bente, Islamist rebels have captured territory in eastern Syria from US-backed Kurdish forces. Why are we seeing this advance now?
Well, you have to remember that a large part of the territory that so far has been controlled by the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces is Arab territory. The Kurds have their home in Hasaka and Qamishli in the very northeast of the country, but over the past years they have ruled over the entire area east of Euphrates. And so there is an Arab population that has been partly cooperating with SDF, though they have also joined the ranks of SDF. However, I think for many it has been difficult to have this Kurdish domination far outside originally Kurdish territories. And therefore, I think we see also pictures of people cheering on the streets. I think it is a risky moment. And of course, any change now between Kurdish and Arab power relations, it's very sensitive. However, I think this is where it comes from.
A ceasefire was agreed yesterday between the Kurdish SDF and the SNA, Turkish-backed forces. What can you tell us about the conditions?
Well, this is absolutely important because other than HTS, it's SNA, the Syrian National Army, that is supported by Turkey. So I think we were mostly looking at what happens between the two of them. And I think the displacement we've seen over the past days, I think there were hundreds of thousands reported to be fleeing areas, mainly Kurds fleeing from Minbij, from Tel Rifat, etc. So it is good that there is a ceasefire, and I think that the main aim is to prevent further forced displacement and to assure everybody there is no fighting intended. We will need to see how that materializes, because at the same time we've also seen Turkish bombardments on Kurdish territory in northeastern Syria. So I think we will need not only the agreement between these two, but we will also need to see what Turkey in the end says and what it does.
You mentioned the mass displacement in the region. Can you tell us more about how civilians, Kurdish civilians in the region, have experienced the days since the regime fell?
Well, I think mainly it was joy because they have suffered under the Assad regime. About 300,000 Syrian Kurds never got the Syrian nationality because it was also not allowed for them to have their rights, to celebrate their feasts, to have their language, etc. It was a repressive regime against them. So this is why I think the feeling of joy was there, because they knew now a new era could start for them and possibly autonomy. However, they also were afraid that this might not last, that there might be incursion of Arab interests, of HTS and others. And so I think it was mixed feelings. So now I think what matters for them is to see how can they get in a strong negotiating position and stay really a valid partner for negotiations. For this, the international backing of the Kurds would be quite crucial. And this is mainly materializing in the presence of US American troops. Trump formerly said that he would withdraw all US soldiers, this would be a game changer. And we don't know what happens if then in January he takes over, whether this is still valid or whether he might change course.
Where do you see at this point in time Kurdish aspirations for self-governance and autonomy?
Well, one very relevant point is the control of resources, because in Assad's Syria, the areas that they controlled or in which they were present served also for the wheat provision, for example. It's very fertile areas with water that is lacking in many other areas of Syria. So they felt that they always had to give towards Damascus and they would be kept in a benign situation. I think now they really want to make sure that they can control their resources, that they are recognized as an entity that has a self-governance, which they established over the past years. And I think they might be eyeing at something similar to Iraq, where this is already kind of the arrangement the Iraqi Kurds have with the rest of the state.
One international player who would not like to see this happen is Turkey. How much of a destabilizing factor are they in this already very volatile situation?
I already mentioned the bombardments, and these, of course, are key because the fear that comes from them, it mirrors that for them, the war as it was fought before in other areas is not over. But I think maybe more relevant in the overall picture is the structural dependency, because Turkey controls the border all along the north. For the Kurdish areas, of course, we have access through Iraq as well. But I think it is really relevant that the structural dependence on Turkey is there for the entire north of Syria. And that is particularly true for the water resources, because Turkish dam projects have controlled how much water then flows into Syria. And I think this has been politicized quite a lot over the past by Turkey. Therefore, I think we will see a situation in which, against Turkish interests, it's not possible to create an autonomy for the Kurds, and also the whole north, the western part is also depending on it. This gives Turkey quite some leverage, even though it might not be very visible in a military sense.
That was Middle East expert Bente Scheller. Always great to get your insights. Thanks.
Thank you.